Carmine Galante was born in an East Harlem tenement building on February 21, 1910, to parents Vincenzo Galante and Vincenza Russo. His parents were Sicilian immigrants, with his father hailing from Castellammare del Golfo and his mother hailing from Caltanissetta. Carmine was the second oldest of 5 children. He had an older brother, a younger brother, and 2 younger sisters. By the age of 10, Carmine had already stopped attending school regularly and started getting involved in petty criminal activity, eventually being sent to reform school. He would be sent to reform school as an incorrigible defendant, meaning that by this point he was already considered beyond rehabilitation. After a short stint in reform school, Carmine would officially get involved in the streets, dropping out of school permanently at the age of 15. Later, Galante would grow close to Giuseppe Joe Beck di Palermo. Di Palermo was a heroin dealer based in Lower Manhattan with ties to the Reina crime family. Around this time, Di Palermo and Galante would join forces in their criminal activities. On December 12, 1925, Galante would plead guilty to an assault charge. The next year, he would receive a sentence of 2.5 years in state prison. Upon his release, Galante would continue his rise in the criminal underworld. On March 15, 1930, Officer Walter Di Castillo would be assigned the task of guarding the manager of the Weinstein Shoe Company as he withdrew a sum of $7,200 to pay his employees. When De Castillo and the manager arrived back at the company's office building at 35 York Street in Lower Manhattan, they would be caught by 5 men. One man would wait in the elevator as the other 4 ran onto the floor with their guns pointed at De Castillo and the manager. De Castillo would reach for his gun, resulting in the 4 gunmen shooting him multiple times, killing him instantly. The 5 men involved would flee the scene. During the investigation, the idea that the murder of Di Castillo was the result of a failed robbery would be very quickly ruled out, as the assailants didn't even attempt to take the money. In August, Galante would be arrested and questioned in relation to the murder. However, he would be released shortly after due to a lack of evidence. On December 24, 1930, Galante and 3 others would be involved in a robbery at a brewery in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. After this, all 4 would flee in a blue sedan. Later, Officer Joseph Minahan would find the car containing the 4 men parked near a delivery truck. Suspecting that they were going to rob the truck, Minahan would decide to confront the 4 men in the car. As he was approaching, he would be noticed by Galante, who went for his revolver. Galante would fire 5 shots at Minahan before he left the car with his 3 accomplices, who also opened fire on the officer. Every bullet fired would miss its target, and the 4 men would mount the truck they were about to rob in order to escape. Galante's 3 accomplices would be successful. However, Galante would lose his grip on the moving truck and slip off. As this happened, Minahan and another officer would chase Galante down the street. Galante would continue firing at the 2 officers, striking Minahan in the leg before eventually being caught. Upon his arrest, he would be interrogated and beaten by officers who demanded he name his accomplices. Galante refused and would ultimately be charged with 2 counts of assault and robbery. In February of 1931, Galante would plead guilty to all charges, receiving a sentence of 12.5 years in Sing Sing prison. During his time in prison, Galante would be referred to a prison psychiatrist who diagnosed him as having a psychopathic personality, going on to describe him as emotionally dull and indifferent. By 1933, Galante had joined a Sicilian prison gang. Early on January 26, this gang would get into an altercation with a Neapolitan gang. A knife fight would ensue that resulted in several inmates on both sides being stabbed, with Galante receiving minor injuries. By 1938, Galante had been transferred to the Clinton Correctional Facility. During this time, Luciano family boss, Charles Lucky Luciano, was also incarcerated there, serving a 30 to 50 year sentence for compulsory prostitution. On May 1, 1939, Galante would be released from prison on parole after serving just over 8 years of his sentence. Soon after his release from prison, Galante would reunite with his old friend Joe Di Palermo. Di Palermo was now an official member of the Galliano crime family, now led by Tommaso Galliano after the murder of original family boss, Gaetano Reina. Galante would also begin working alongside members of the Bonanno crime family, being inducted around the same time. On January 11, 1943, far-left Italian activist Carlo Tresca stepped outside of his office on the corner of West 15th Street. Tresca, who was a major opponent of Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini, was set to hold a meeting that evening of the anti-fascist Italian-American Mazzini Society. When no one arrived at this meeting, he decided to leave his office. Just as he was crossing the street, a black Ford pulled up. Carmine Galante would step out and shoot Tresca in the head at point-blank range before speeding off, leaving him dead on the scene. Earlier that same day, Galante had checked in with his parole officer. After this, his parole officer would recall seeing him leave in a black Ford with the same license plate as the car that was used in the Tresca murder. Galante would be arrested and questioned in relation to the murder. However, there was insufficient evidence to charge him. Despite this, Galante would still be sent back to prison on a parole violation. The murder of Carlo Tresca was likely ordered by Francesco Frank Garofalo, the underboss of the Bonanno family. Garofalo had his own issues with Tresca as he had exposed his business relationship with legitimate Italian businessman Generoso Pope. It's also possible Garofalo ordered the Tresca murder as a favor to Luciano family underboss Vito Genovese. Genovese had fled the United States in 1937 to avoid being prosecuted for murder, settling in Naples, Italy. During his time in Italy, Genovese had formed a close relationship with Mussolini and was a major supporter of his regime. Galante would serve over a year in prison before being released on December 21, 1944. After his release from prison, Galante would spend the rest of the 40s consolidating his power within the Bonanno family, eventually getting involved in illegal gambling. On December 14, 1950, he would be arrested in Brooklyn and questioned regarding a large-scale gambling operation that was being run by Tofanio Steve Di Palermo, the brother of Galante's lifelong friend Joe Di Palermo. Galante would be released the next day due to a lack of evidence. Galante, alongside his boss, Joe Bonanno, would also get involved in the heroin business. In 1953, Galante and Bonanno would establish a pipeline for heroin to be imported from Canada into the US. Bonanno would send Galante to Montreal to oversee this operation. The way this operation worked was Turkish farmers would grow opium poppies that would be sent to Marseille, France, where they would be processed into heroin. From there, the pure heroin would be shipped into Canada, where it would be distributed within the country and imported to the US. Bonanno would ultimately give Galante full control of this business, officially making him a capo in the family. Over the next few years, Galante would grow to become incredibly wealthy and powerful. As a result, he would begin working to set up several other criminal operations alongside the Montreal-based Cotroni crime family. One of these operations was a large-scale gambling operation that brought in up to $50 million a year. Also during his time in Montreal, Galante, who was already fluent in English, Sicilian, and Italian, would pick up French as well. This allowed him to deal directly with the Marseille-based heroin traffickers. By 1957, the Canadian government had been made aware of Galante's activities. As a result, he would be deported back to the US. Upon his return, Bonanno would allow him to seize control over the heroin distribution business in the US. In October of that same year, Galante, Bonanno, and family underboss Frank Garofalo would meet with members of the Sicilian mafia at the Grand Hotel Ede Palm in Palermo, Sicily. This meeting would also be attended by Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano, who was released from prison and deported to Italy in 1946, had a major interest in the heroin business and would begin working with the Sicilian mafia in order to profit from it. The result of this meeting was that many Sicilian mobsters would be inducted into the Bonanno family and brought to the US in order to allow the Sicilians to profit from the very lucrative heroin trafficking business. These Sicilian inductees would go on to be known as Zips. In 1958, Galante would be indicted on federal narcotics charges. He would be indicted alongside more than 30 other mobsters from all 5 families, including Joe Beck Di Palermo and Luciano family boss Vito Genovese. The previous year, Genovese, who had been back in the US for around a decade after beating his murder charge, would make an attempt on the life of acting boss Frank Costello. Costello would then step down and allow Genovese to take over the family. Upon his rise to the position of boss, Genovese would get the family involved in narcotics trafficking, likely with the assistance of previous family boss Charlie Luciano. Galante would hear about the indictments and decide to go on the run, not being caught until June of 1959. That same year, Genovese and Di Palermo would both receive sentences of 15 years in federal prison. Galante, while on bail, would be indicted on further charges related to narcotics trafficking. After his first trial ended in a mistrial, Galante would be tried again and convicted. On July 10, 1962, Galante would be sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. While Genovese was incarcerated, he would order several murders. Genovese believed that members of his family and other families were responsible for having him indicted. At some point, Genovese would hire Joe Di Palermo to kill a soldier in his family. This soldier was Joe Valachi. Valachi, who had also been indicted on narcotics charges, was growing increasingly paranoid. He was certain that Genovese would order his death. His paranoia would eventually result in him killing an inmate who he believed was sent to kill him. On June 22, 1962, Valachi would kill fellow inmate Joseph South by beating him to death with a lead pipe. After this, Valachi would be convinced to turn state's witness and testify before a U.S. Senate subcommittee regarding organized crime in America. Valachi would describe 5 active crime families in New York: the Gambino family, the Genovese family, of which he was a member, the Lucchese family, the Profaci family, and finally the Bonanno family, stating that Carmine Galante was the underboss of this family. In 1963, while Galante was incarcerated, Joe Bonanno would conspire with Profaci family boss Giuseppe Joe Magliocco to seize control of the commission. They would conspire to kill Gaetano Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, Stefano Magaddino, and Frank De Simone. Magliocco would order his family capo, Joseph Colombo, to have this carried out. Colombo would instead alert Gambino and Lucchese about Bonanno and Magliocco's plans. Magliocco would be called before the commission and was forced to step down as boss of his family. This would result in Colombo being appointed to the position of boss. Bonanno, fearing the consequences of his plot to overthrow the commission, would flee to Montreal, where he would stay for a year. Upon his return to the US in 1964, Bonanno would disappear. His lawyers claimed he was kidnapped by men working under Stefano Magaddino. However, there was no evidence of this, and it was more likely that Bonanno disappeared on his own accord to avoid having to testify before a grand jury and to avoid having to face repercussions from the commission. While Bonanno was gone, a high-ranking member of his family would take over as boss. Gaspar Di Gregorio would be officially named the new boss of the family by the commission, much to the dismay of Bonanno's son, Salvatore Bill Bonanno, and Bonanno's loyalists. After a war within the family that saw both Bill Bonanno and Gaspar Di Gregorio wounded, the commission would force Di Gregorio to step down. In 1966, Joe Bonanno would return to support his son in the conflict. However, after Di Gregorio stepped down, Bonanno would voluntarily step down, and he and his son would retire from the family. After this, Di Gregorio loyalist Paul Sciacca would be named by the commission as the new boss of the family in 1968. The next year, on February 14, 1969, Galante's co-defendant, Vito Genovese, would pass away in prison after serving 10 years of his 15-year sentence. While he was in prison, Galante became resentful of the commission, often expressing his hatred of Carlo Gambino, in particular to Patriarca family associate Vincent Teresa. It's unknown exactly why Galante carried so much contempt for Gambino. It could have possibly been due to Gambino's involvement in Joe Bonanno stepping down, as Galante was still a staunch Bonanno loyalist. Galante also seemed to hold former Luciano family boss, Frank Costello, in contempt as well. Also during his time in prison, Galante would be locked up alongside several notable figures in organized crime, including Genovese family capo, Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, who was in prison for extortion, and a young Gambino family associate named John Gotti, who was incarcerated for truck hijacking. On January 24, 1974, Galante would be paroled after serving 12 years of his 20-year sentence. Upon his release, Galante would seek revenge against everyone he perceived to have wronged him. On the 26th, just 2 days after his release, someone would bomb Frank Costello's mausoleum at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, New York. Costello had died just under a year before Galante was released, passing away due to natural causes on February 18, 1973. Just months before Galante's release, family boss Natale Evola would pass away on August 28, 1973. The month after Galante's release, in February, the commission would back high-ranking family member Philip Rusty Rastelli to succeed Evola. After this, Galante would work to consolidate his power in the Bonanno family. He would monopolize the heroin distribution business in New York and import several soldiers from Sicily to work under him. The reason Galante used Sicilians was likely because they had no prior connection to any bosses in New York and would be completely loyal to him. Two of these Sicilian enforcers were Cesare Bonventre and Baldassare Amato, with Bonventre acting as Galante's personal bodyguard. In March of 1975, family boss Philip Rusty Rastelli would be indicted on extortion charges stemming from his control of the food truck business. By August of 1976, Rastelli had been convicted, and he would go on to receive a 10-year sentence. The commission would allow Rastelli to maintain his position as boss of the Bonanno crime family. However, despite this, Galante had other plans. He would use his power and influence to seize control of the family, becoming the unsanctioned acting boss by the end of 1976. Also in 1976, on October 15th, Carlo Gambino would pass away in his home due to natural causes. By 1977, the commission was made up of Paul Castellano as boss of the Gambino family, Philip Lombardo as boss of the Genovese family, with Frank Alphonse Thierry acting as his front boss, Anthony Tony Dux Corallo as boss of the Lucchese family, Carmine Jr. Persico as boss of the Colombo family with his brother, Alphonse leading the family as acting boss while Carmine was incarcerated, and of course Rastelli as boss of the Bonanno family with Galante having replaced him without the commission's approval. Supposedly around this time the commission would vote on whether or not to have Galante killed, with all but Persico and the Colombo family voting in favor of it. Allegedly, even Joe Bonanno himself approved of this idea. However, before anything could be carried out, Galante would have his parole revoked on March 3, 1978, and would not be released until February 27, 1979. When Galante was released from prison, two Rastelli loyalists and Bonanno family soldiers, Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano and Joseph Massino, would obtain Rastelli's approval to have Galante killed. When they brought this to the commission, it would officially sanction the murder. On July 12, 1979, Galante was dining at Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn, with family capo Leonard Coppola and restaurant owner Giuseppe Turano. Alongside them were Galante's bodyguards Cesare Bonventre and Baldassare Amato. At around 2:45 p.m., the five men would be caught by three masked gunmen. The gunmen left Bonventre and Amato and began firing at Galante and his two companions, killing Galante and Coppola instantly, with Turano succumbing to his wounds as he was being taken to hospital. Soon after this, Rastelli would take back control of the family and promote both Sonny Black Napolitano and Joe Massino to capos. Another Bonanno family member to be promoted after the Galante murder was Galante's former bodyguard, Cesare Bonventre, who was also made a capo. A few years after the murder of Galante in 1981, Massino would get word that three Bonanno family capos were planning to murder high-ranking Rastelli loyalists in order to take control of the family for themselves. The three men, Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato, Dominic Trinchera, and Philip Giacone, were ratted out by a Colombo family associate who informed Massino that they had put things in place to kill both him and Napolitano. Massino, with the backing of Rastelli as well as Colombo family boss Carmine Persico and Gambino family boss Paul Castellano, would act first. On May 5, 1981, Massino and Napolitano would be able to lure the three rogue family capos to a meeting. As soon as the three men walked into the 2020 nightclub in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, they were ambushed by several gunmen who fired at them with shotguns, killing them instantly. Allegedly, one of the shooters was future Montreal family boss Vito Rizzuto. Soon after the three capos were murdered, Massino and Napolitano would order Bruno Indelicato to be murdered. Bruno was the son of Alphonse and was supposed to attend the meeting at the 2020 nightclub with his father. Napolitano would entrust an associate of his crew with having this carried out. He was likely going to have this associate formally inducted after the murder of Bruno Indelicato. However, this murder would never be carried out. The man who was given the contract, Donnie Brasco, was actually an undercover FBI agent who was sent to infiltrate the Bonanno family around the time Galante was killed. Brasco, whose real name was Joseph Pistone, would be pulled out by the FBI shortly after this. Upon the discovery that Napolitano had almost inducted an FBI agent into the family, his once ally Joe Massino would turn on him and order his murder. On August 17, 1981, Napolitano would be summoned to a meeting at the house of a Bonanno family associate, from which he would never return. In the early 1980s, Joe Bonanno, who had been in retirement since 1968, would decide to write a book about his life in the mafia. The book, entitled A Man of Honor, would be released in 1983 and would become a bestseller. Bonanno likely believed that writing the book would be inconsequential. Being a founding member of the commission, Bonanno would only implicate people who had since passed away. However, this book would be one of many things that led to Rudy Giuliani going after the mafia. Giuliani, who in 1983 was appointed to the position of U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, would eventually use Bonanno's book as a foundation upon which he would build a case against the whole mafia commission. Giuliani would collaborate with the FBI to build this case. Indictments would come down on February 25, 1985. Those indicted were Paul Castellano, who was boss of the Gambino family, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, who was the boss of the Genovese family, Anthony Tony Dux Corallo, who was boss of the Lucchese family, Carmine Persico, who was boss of the Colombo family, and finally Philip Rastelli, who was boss of the Bonanno family. Rastelli, who had been released from prison in 1983, would only be out of prison for less than a year before the indictments came down. Also indicted were a few high-ranking members of each family, including Bruno Indelicato. During the investigation into the commission, the government would use the murder of Carmine Galante to prove the existence and authority of the commission. They would discover when re-investigating the Galante killing that Indelicato had left a palm print on the car used in the murder. He would then be indicted for murder and tried alongside the bosses of the families. On November 19, 1986, all indicted, except Paul Castellano, who had been murdered in December of 1985, and Rastelli, who had been dropped from the case due to another federal indictment he was facing, would be convicted. The bosses and their subordinates would receive 100-year sentences, and Indelicato would receive a sentence of 40 years in federal prison for the murder of Carmine Galante.